Imprint is a mechanic that was originally introduced in Mirrodin in 2003. Appearing primarily on artifacts, a card with Imprint has you exile a card, and then it does something related to one of those cards' qualities. Overall, this makes it a fairly flexible mechanic, with cards with Imprint doing all sorts of different things depending on the card that is exiled. For example, Extraplanar Lens imprints a land you control and then makes lands with the same name produce extra mana, and Mirror Golem exiles a card from a graveyard and gains protection from that card's types. Imprint has been prominently featured in the aforementioned Mirrodin, as well as the next set Darksteel, and it also made several appearances in Scars of Mirrodin block, and it has since made occasional appearances in non-standard release sets, like Modern Horizons and Doctor Who. In all, there are 28 cards with Imprint in Magic, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Here's a reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. I use a scoring system where cards are awarded 2 points for first tier top 8s, like Pro Tours, and 1 point for second tier top 8s, like regional championships. At number 10, it's Strata Scythe. For 3 generic mana, this is an equipment artifact. When it enters, you search up a basic land from your deck and imprint it on the scythe, and the equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land on the battlefield with the same name as that exiled card, and it equips for 3 generic mana. Strata Scythe can make a creature absolutely massive, especially in a monocolored deck, since you often control lots of lands with only one name. It gained both of its points in standard Quest for the Holy Relic decks, which were all about equipment. The deck could stick the Scythe into play directly with the Quest or Stoneforge Mystic, and equip it for free using Core Outfitter. Strata Scythe hasn't gained any points in almost a decade and a half though, and if we keep on periodically getting imprint cards like we have lately, it's probably not going to be on this list very much longer. At number 9, it's Knowledge Pool. It's an artifact that costs 6 generic mana, and when it enters, it imprints the top 3 cards of each player's library, and whenever a player casts a spell from his or her hand, that player exiles it, and when they do, they can cast another non-land card exiled with Knowledge Pool without paying that card's mana cost. This is a pretty wacky effect as it imprints a bunch of random cards up front, and then imprints every other spell that gets cast while it's in play, and then players get a choice from among all those other exiled cards and get to cast one for free. Notably, it doesn't matter who that card belongs to. You have access to everything that has been exiled by the pool, not just your own stuff. Knowledge Pool's points have all come in Modern, where it's seen some play in control decks alongside Teferi Mage of Zhalfir or Teferi Time Raveler. Both Teferis only let you cast spells when you could cast a sorcery, and the action of Knowledge Pool happens when a sorcery cannot be cast, so they don't get to cast anything. This lock never caught on in a big way in Modern though, and Knowledge Pool hasn't gained any points since 2021. At number 8, it's Semblance Anvil. For 3 generic, it's an artifact that lets you imprint a non-land card from your hand when it enters, and spells you cast that share a card type with the imprinted card cost 2 generic less to cast. This does mean you have to 2-for-1 yourself up front to get anything out of the anvil, but oftentimes such a big discount on an entire card type is well worth it. Despite being printed way back in 2010, the anvil didn't start putting up points until 2023. That year it started to see play in both Modern and Legacy Mystic Forge decks. The Forge lets you cast artifacts off the top of your library, and decks that look to abuse the Forge run a whole bunch of artifacts, so if you use the anvil to decrease the cost of your artifacts, it becomes quite easy to rip through your whole deck, especially if you're running a bunch of artifacts that cost 2 mana or less. These decks can win by putting Aetherflux Reservoir into play before going off, gaining a bunch of life, and then paying 50 to kill the opponent. So far, these decks haven't done anything in 2024, but Semblance Anvil clearly has potential as a combo enabler alongside Mystic Forge, so it's hard to count out entirely. At number 7, it's Phyrexian Ingester, the only non-colorless card on this list. For 6 generic and a blue, it's a 3/3, and when it enters, you can imprint target non-token creature, and the Ingester gets +X/+Y, where X is the exiled creature's power, and Y is its toughness. So this is a creature that comes down, exiles your opponent's best creature, and then the Ingester gets a stats boost too. Adding to the board while removing something of your opponent's is always a powerful play, and it makes the Ingester well worth the 7 mana in many cases. In Standard, a singleton copy was sometimes played in Birthing Pod decks, which were adept at tutoring up creatures for an ideal situation, and grabbing the Ingester with the pod was a good way to go when your opponent had a particularly problematic creature in play. In Legacy, it was played as a sideboard card in Loam decks, where it could be brought in against Reanimator opponents looking to cast Exhume. The deck often had a Phyrexian Ingester in the graveyard in the extreme early game thanks to Entomb, and that would negate whatever your opponent reanimated. However, Phyrexian Ingester hasn't put up any top 8s in about a decade. At number 6, it's Panoptic Mirror. This artifact costs 5 generic, and it has an activated ability that imprints when you pay X mana and tap the mirror, and you exile an instant or sorcery card from your hand with mana value X. Then at the beginning of your upkeep, you copy a card exiled with the mirror, and you cast it without paying its mana cost. So you have to give up a card and spend some mana without actually adding to the board, but then you get the card for free during each of your turns for the rest of the game. It certainly takes some time and setup, but you can't say that the payoff isn't super powerful. If you put the right spell on the mirror, you can just lock your opponent out of the game. For that reason, it's actually banned in Commander, but it's never been banned in 60-card formats. In Standard, it was played in land destruction decks that could use it to cast Plow Under every turn, which effectively creates a lock. It was also played in modern Time Walk decks, which could create a lock by imprinting Time Warp and other Time Walk effects. However, the mirror hasn't put up any top 8 since 2020. At number 5, it's Ugin's Labyrinth, the newest card on the list. It's a land, and when it enters the battlefield, you can imprint a colorless card with mana value 7 or greater from your hand. You can tap the Labyrinth for colorless, and if a card is imprinted on it, you get 2 colorless instead. Unlike the other cards on this list, you can also get the card back that you imprint on the Labyrinth, in this case, just by tapping it. The last part's pretty sweet because sometimes you find yourself in a pinch and you wish you could get an imprinted card back, and the Labyrinth actually lets you do it. And it's especially sweet here because you can play this in the early game and imprint a big ol' Eldrazi on it, use it to ramp your mana, and then if you need to find a win condition, you can just get it back. Ugin's Labyrinth is from Modern Horizons 3, so the only 60-card formats it's legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. While it hasn't seen much play in Legacy or Vintage, which don't really have a need for this card since Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, and Eye of Ugin are all better, but none of those are legal in Modern, where the only other colorless fast mana land is Eldrazi Temple, and you can see that those two work quite nicely together in an Eldrazi ramp deck. And that's exactly where the Labyrinth has been seeing play since being printed earlier this year. It has a very real shot at rocketing up this list since it's so good in Modern, and it doesn't really look like that's going to change. At number 4, it's Duplicant. For 6 generic mana, it's a 2/4 artifact creature, and when it enters, you imprint a non-token creature, and Duplicant has that card's power, toughness, and creature types. In other words, it's a 6 mana 2/4 that exiles an opposing creature, and has a whole bunch of upside. It's basically the original version of the Ingester we saw earlier, so I don't need to say again how good it is to have a creature that removes a creature. Duplicant was played in half the decks, the top 8 at the Mirrodin Block Pro Tour, appearing in Big Red and 12-post decks. Both could potentially ramp out the Duplicant early. It also gained a single point in an extended sneak attack deck where it was useful because it coming down and attacking only a single time still means you get to remove a creature for 1 mana. It has also gained points in Legacy and Vintage Mud decks, which are artifact-based ramp, so again, they can power out Duplicant early, which is really nice. It tends to be especially good against opposing players who use Show and Tell or the aforementioned Exhume, since it can just erase whatever scary threat is put into play. However, Duplicant hasn't put up any top 8 since 2020. At number 3, it's Mimic Vat. For 3 generic mana, it's an artifact that can exile and imprint a non-token creature when that creature dies. If you do that, you return each other card exiled with the Vat to its owner's graveyard. You can also pay 3 generic and tap the Vat to make a token copy of a card imprinted on it. It gains haste and gets exiled at the beginning of the next in step. Basically, the Vat can imprint 1 creature at a time, and every time a creature dies, you have the option of having a new one that you can make copies of with the activated ability. Obviously, if the right creature gets imprinted, making a token copy of it every turn can be awesome. It also provides a little bit of graveyard hate, because if your opponent has a creature die that you really don't want them to be able to get back, you can just imprint it. Mimic Vat gained all of its points in Standard, where it was particularly good in Birthing Pod decks, since you could sacrifice a creature in play to search another one up, but imprint the one you sacrificed on the Vat if you want to hold on to having access to that card. It was played in Primeval Titan decks too, where if your opponent managed to take down your big giant, you could imprint it and still get the enters and attacks triggers every turn thanks to the Vat. Mimic Vat hasn't gained any points though since rotating out of Standard. At number 2, it's Isochron Scepter. For 2 generic mana, it's an artifact, and when it enters, you exile an instant with mana value 2 or less from your hand. Then you can pay 2 generic and tap the Scepter to make a copy of the exiled card and cast it without paying its mana cost. While the Scepter is pretty specific about what can be imprinted on it, only 2 mana or less instants, it turns out there are plenty of instants that cost that much that are insane if you cast them every single turn. While there weren't enough cards to do that in Blocker Standard, Isochron Scepter had a huge impact on Extended. At first it was played in control decks that could imprint something like Counterspell on it, but the best thing to imprint was often Fire and Ice, a split card. Back then, you could imprint Fire and Ice since each spell on it individually cost 2 or less, and every time you activated the Scepter you got to choose either side. This made the Scepter very flexible and very powerful. However, the nastiest thing you could do with the Scepter in Extended was to combine it with Orym's Chant in a prison deck appropriately called Scepter Chant. If you imprint Orym's Chant on the Scepter, your opponent won't be attacking or casting spells for the rest of the game. It's not quite Time Walk every turn, but it's pretty close. Between 2003 and 2005, the Scepter was even good enough to top 8 events in Legacy and Vintage. It would later see some play in Modern between 2012 and 2013, where it was played alongside super flexible and powerful charms that were printed in Return to Ravnica block. However, it went quiet in the format for quite some time, until something interesting happened earlier this year. Orym's Chant got reprinted in Modern Horizons 3, making it legal in the format for the first time. This has led to a bit of a resurgence for Isochron Scepter in the format, and it looks like it's going to continue to be played at least a little bit in Modern. If you want a deeper dive on Isochron Scepter decks from over the years, check out my How Good Was Isochron Scepter Actually video, where I do a deep dive on the topic. However, even though Isochron Scepter has started to see play in Modern again, it has no hope of ever catching the number 1 card on this list, which is Chrome Mox. This is probably the card you first thought of when you think of the imprint mechanic, and for good reason. It's one of the best mana rocks of all time. For 0 mana, it's an artifact that imprints a non-artifact non-land card from your hand when it enters, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of the imprinted card's colors to your mana pool. So yeah, 0 mana rocks are really good, even if you have to 2-for-1 yourself for them, since you get so far ahead on mana. The Mox started seeing play in every single one of Magic's formats upon being printed, quickly getting restricted in Vintage and banned in Legacy, and when Modern was created in 2011, it had to be banned in the format since it didn't really want decks to be a full turn faster in the new format. These days, it's fully legal in both Legacy and Vintage, and as you'd imagine, it sees lots of play in both formats. Chrome Mox has a massive lead on everything on this list, and it's only going to get larger. It's definitely the best card with Imprint in the history of Magic. So, those are the top 10 cards with Imprint. Do you want to imprint some cards? If so, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to see more videos that look at Magic's mechanics, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to catch future MTG Top 10s and lots of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.